Oh, hello there. Just reading a book about movies. Alright, so anyway, this video is quite simple. There are lots and lots of movies out there, tons of movies, and it can be quite difficult to, find the right stuff. There's just too much out there. So, put together some recommendations. Hopefully, at least some of them are worthwhile to you.
Now, I have put together a list of 21 films that some people may have never seen. If you have seen every single one on the list, then this video really wasn't for you, I'm afraid. But hopefully, you found out about at least a handful of new films. Okay, so these movies vary in fame, but I have personally selected them because I just don't hear people talking about them, and so they are anecdotally lesser known films. And I have laid them out in alphabetical order because I do not want there to be any implication that any are inherently superior to any other. One film breaks the alphabetical rule though, and that's because it's influenced by the style of film that precedes it. Every recommendation will also come with a couple of caveats at the end because, as we should all know, art doesn't necessarily age well in every department, and so whenever any of these films has, let's say for instance, a racial or sexual slur, well then I will have noted that. I don't want anyone to go into a film on my recommendation to then find that something in that film was maybe something they didn't want to see. So, without further ado, okay, maybe one more little thing. Some of these are based on books, and I have not read the books, so this is solely based on the films themselves. Also, another last thing, all the clips used in this video are from trailers, because I don't want to run afoul of copyright nonsense if at all possible. Okay, so with that out the way, let's get started. Galaxy Quest, 1999. Many films just deserve to get a lot more love than they ever got, and while Galaxy Quest pretty much became a cult classic, far too few people have actually seen it. It is, on the surface, a parody of / homage to Star Trek, but it's not your average parody. It's not Scary Movie or Epic Movie or the million other copy-pasted parody films. This one is a bit higher budget, and it has a fantastic cast who get into their roles perfectly. In the film, the actors of a Star Trek-esque show called Galaxy Quest are just living their lives on the convention circuit, never really getting new acting gigs because they lived out their heyday 20 years ago, until a group of real aliens come along and ask for their help. The aliens have modeled their entire civilization on Galaxy Quest and believe that the sci-fi show is a series of historical documents, and so the crew of actors has to become a real spaceship crew and try to help out these aliens. The movie is the perfect homage, and the likes of Tim Allen, Sigourney Weaver, Alec Rickman, Tony Shalhoub, and Sam Rockwell make it even better. They work off one another splendidly and really capture the has-been actor vibe while being constantly shocked and terrified that everything is actually real. Not to mention all the scenes that capture the ludicrous nature of things like Star Trek with countdowns that stop at 1 second before self-destruction, because that's what happens in the movies, or how only one character can speak to the ship's computer because she was always the one who talked to it on the show. This whole movie is bound to put a smile on your face, and you don't always need intellectual films because you just need something fun. And speaking of fun, Hamlet 2, 2008. What do you do when you can't act? Well, you teach drama. Or at least that's how it quite often goes, and that's how it goes in Hamlet 2. This movie definitely falls within the camp of more offensive fare, but it's mostly being offensive towards actors and religion, so it's fine. So, what is this truly glorious thing about? Well, first of all, I would kind of recommend having at least a passing familiarity with the original Hamlet, as in the Shakespeare play, and that's just because part of the movie makes more sense when you're familiar with it. At the very least, read the synopsis on Wikipedia. But to the movie itself, it follows a failed actor, played by Steve Coogan, who has a drama class where he puts on really bad plays based on movies rather than on plays like he maybe should. He acts like a truly pretentious actor sort, and his existence is immensely sad but played for kicks, because why not? And he needs to deal with his drama department being shut down right after he got a big influx of students, and so he writes a play, a sequel to the great Elizabethan tragedy Hamlet, a task that ends up involving a lot of offensive stuff, pretty much all of the offensive stuff, like sexual assault jokes, gay jokes. If you can stomach the kind of topics you'd find in South Park, then you should be able to handle it, but it's better than South Park. It has more of a point to make. It's also written by an old South Park writer, so, that makes sense. The movie is irreverent, offensive, but fun and massively underappreciated. It also turns in a fantastic starring role for Coogan, who usually plays like side characters, and so it's fun to just see him throwing everything into this and being overly dramatic. It also stars the massively underappreciated Elizabeth Shue as herself, and she's always a delight. So, do you want to see an overacting drama teacher trying to put on a sequel to one of the greatest tragedies in the English language and failing upwards? Well, then watch it. But it is offensive, and it's full of cringe scenarios. Great fun. Her, 2013. Time for some sad people being sad. Now, before we begin with this one, if you're familiar with the Bad Religion song I Love My Computer, then this is like the film version of that. It's all about a man who is rather sad and lonely, and then he downloads a new operating system that is run by an AI. And he starts to fall in love with said AI. It's set in a near-future world in which things are just a little bit off from our own. For instance, everyone has voice recognition devices that help them manage their lives, their news feeds, their emails, etc. Just think of it as a world in which we have become more connected to technology than ever before. And it probably isn't so good for us. You can also think of it like a 2-hour Black Mirror episode, because it treads similar ground, but going into specific details would spoil things, obviously. Just think of it as the story of a man who slowly falls in love with a machine, and it makes him happy. It makes him enjoy life after he got hit with a big breakup. It's a bittersweet story, and it probably isn't for everyone, but if you want Joaquin Phoenix in a fantastically subdued role that shows the highs and lows of ordinary relationships, but with a very not ordinary situation, or at least from a place that isn't, ordinary yet, then you may be interested. Love can spring from the least likely places, and this movie examines that love. It won't be for everyone, but it certainly is worth a watch to see something quite different to your average romance. Imaginaerum, 2012. First things first, if you're a fan of Nightwish and you're unfamiliar with this movie, well then it's for you, because this is basically Nightwish the movie. It's a framed narrative that on the surface is about an old man with dementia who's dying, and it's also about his Wonderland-esque final dreams. These dreams show him as a boy as he travels through his subconscious with the help of a scary snowman and a whole bunch of Nightwish music. It's all about the descent into the mind of a dying man as he grapples with his memories, his regrets, his fears, and he tries to break out of it for long enough to see the real world one last time before dying. It's all about death, the fear of death, and accepting death. It's a darkly surreal Wonderland experience with not too much plot, but a whole load of gorgeous cinematography and imaginative imagery. It's something to look at and to experience, to listen to as one musical scene shifts into the next. Not exactly a movie that can be explained in the traditional sense, because it's essentially a 90-minute music video. So if you want a unique visual experience that you'll likely remember for a long time, give it a watch. But if you don't care for symphonic metal or spectacle-heavy films, then maybe it ain't for you. Also, if you like Pink Floyd's The Wall, you may just like this too, because, similar vibes, although it does not cover the same material at all. Kung Pao, Enter the Fist, 2002. Sometimes you need to watch an intentionally bad movie, but sometimes a bad movie can also be fascinating, and Kung Pao is one such movie. The basic premise of the movie is that it took an old Hong Kong kung fu movie called Tiger and Crane Fists and spliced in new footage and then redubbed all the audio to create an entirely new narrative. It's It's quite unlike anything else out there, and then went on to influence the various abridged series that you now find on YouTube by people like Lil Karibo and Team 4-Star. The story follows the Chosen One, a random white dude born to Asian parents and fighting a bunch of Asian people. It is a Hong Kong film, after all. The whole thing is pretty much made up of dubbing jokes, silly editing, ridiculous green screen additions, and an overall parody of kung fu cinema and all things bad film. You know, prophecy nonsense, training montages, silly rivalries, truly terrible CGI. I mean, this is something you could imagine being made by a YouTuber now. However, this is not a movie for people who want something serious. It needs to be consumed with the same attitude you might have when watching something like the Scary Movie franchise. Go in expecting rubbish and you shall receive something a lot better than you may have expected. It is also rather unique, which doesn't make something good, but it certainly is something different. And the fact that every voice is dubbed over by the same guy just makes it entertaining to watch. And now, back to the serious stuff. The Lives of Others, 2006. A man explains to his students how best to break someone down until they tell their secrets, explaining to them that you need to keep their sweat for sniffer dogs, and how a liar has well-rehearsed lines, but a truthful person might jumble up their story. This is the story of a man who works for the Stasi, the secret police in East Germany during the Cold War. His job is to watch people. His job is to read people and to make them spill the beans. This movie follows Gert Wiesler, a brilliant interrogator who is given the task of bugging the home of a seemingly obedient and non-subversive playwright, after he suspects that the man might not be as obedient to the Communist Party as he appears, and, well, any further than that, and it'd be spoiling the thing, but this film has incredibly subdued performances as people struggle under the oppressive regime that existed in the last few years of the Cold War before Gorbachev's reforms. It paints a picture of a period that is often ignored in popular culture because when you think Cold War communism, you tend to think of the USSR and not so much about East Germany. It's always a story about Russians and never about Germans. Many of us aren't taught about this aspect of Cold War history, and its perspective is almost entirely ignored by the English-speaking world, and that's why this movie is very much in German. So, get a little non-English culture in your lives. Also, this did win an Oscar for Best Foreign Language Film, so it did get high accolades, but that award category tends to be the first to be forgotten when people remember all them Oscar films. Learn a bit about an aspect of history you might not know too well. It's a long film, but certainly worth the watch. Lord of War, 2005. Guns, oh guns, they make the world go round. Then they make it fall over because they got shot. Anyway, Lord of War is about guns. It stars Nicolas Cage in one of his 8,000 roles, and it's definitely one of his better roles. He is Yuri Orlov, an amalgamation of several real-life gun runners, and the movie tells his story. And his story is more fascinating as an overall case study in international gun running than as a straight-up movie. It starts with his early beginnings as a gun runner selling to regular old criminals, but before long he ups his game and starts selling to the international market. He sells to various countries that engage in international and civil wars. It's not a fun story, but it certainly does show how these kinds of things happen and where those groups get their guns. The movie is even officially endorsed by Amnesty International for showing how all this fun old gun running happens. Now, it isn't based on any exact events, but is rather modeled on the kinds of things that did happen. So it's more an inspired by rather than based on kind of movie. It's a colder and more clinical kind of movie. Don't expect any emotional highs or lows, but rather a consistent depressing note. But it's worth the watch because you'll learn a lot. Now, there are a lot of horrible things in it, and if you don't want to see those things, then this is not for you. Lots of murder, including the murder of kids, some child soldiers, the AIDS pandemic, massacres, a lot of drugs, not exactly happy subjects, but hey, sometimes you just need to watch something dark and depressing. Just like the next few things on the list. Okja. 2017. Do you feel like being depressed? Do you feel like seeing a particularly grim movie about what we do to non-human animals? If not, please stay away from this movie. So, Okja is a Korean-American film that takes place in roughly equal parts Korean and English, and also roughly equal parts in South Korea and in the United States. And now, before I even talk about this movie, it was directed and co-written by Bong Joon-ho, who you might recognize as the director/co-writer of the recipient of the 2019 Academy Award for Best Picture, Parasite. Also, I probably said his name wrong. So, there's some name recognition for you if you need it. Now, Okja is all about a genetically modified super pig that is supposed to be a combination of environmentally friendly meat production as well as being delicious. So, one of these so-called super pigs is sent to be raised by a Korean family in the mountains because they want to see which farming method will yield the best pig. And that pig, whose name is Okja, becomes incredibly close with a young girl named Misha. And she wants to see to it that Okja does not become what she was bred to become. The film is a deep criticism of the way we treat non-human animals, with a focus on the animals we use in meat production. The movie was not made by PETA, but you can imagine them producing something like this because it's visceral. It doesn't pull any punches. It shows you exactly the kind of conditions that factory farmed animals go through. It shows a number of real procedures that are done to animals, and so if you have a weak stomach for this kind of thing, it probably won't be for you. But it's also a human story about the potential positive connection between humans and non-human animals. The relationship between Misha and Okja is beautiful, but Okja really should be seen as the main character here. It's her pain and her suffering that's on display, and I haven't seen many films that are such perfect distillations for why people should move towards veganism if possible. The movie isn't for the faint of heart, but this movie is one you're watching more for its heartfelt portrayal of slaughterhouse animals than for any kind of, entertainment value. Oldboy, 2003. Daitsu is just a regular guy, and then one day he gets kidnapped and locked in a strange room. The room becomes his prison for 15 years. He is never told what he was thrown in prison for, and the guards never say a word. It's very Kafkaesque. And then one day, he just gets let out. He wakes up on top of a random building. The world has gone on 15 years, and he has no idea what happened to his wife or daughter, and he still doesn't know what he was thrown in that prison for. So he does what many would likely do. He tries to find out who kidnapped him and why. And this launches Oldboy into a fantastic thriller that feels like a live-action anime. It has weird characters talking weirdly. It has an over-the-top plot that you would never see coming because it's just so out there. And also has one of the best fight scenes of all time. The fight scene could just be watched on YouTube, but you kind of need the full context to really appreciate it for what it is, a desperate man who can't afford to lose. It is a film quite unlike any other. It's a dark, depressing thriller that's a must-watch for anyone into the neo-noir thing. However, be warned, it has a few things that may cause some people to want to stay away. It has stuff like sexual assault, including an attempted rape that the victim then apologizes for, some very anime-like sex, some torture, and even some animal abuse for good measure. And the animal abuse is also real. They killed a real animal for the scene, so if those kinds of things make it a no-no, then that makes complete sense, especially after just recommending Okja. All the heavy stuff adds to the air of strangeness that the movie exudes, though. It's meant to be a rather unhappy and unsettling thing, but don't watch it if all that stuff is too much for you. But if you can handle it, then you'll be in for a wild ride that will likely stick with you for a long time. The Perks of Being a Wallflower, 2012. Sometimes you just need to watch something that reminds you of your teenage years. For many of us, your teenage years were filled with anxiety and issues. They might come right off the back of your childhood years, and there's nothing quite like a childhood to scar you throughout your adolescence, and that's where we get to The Perks of Being a Wallflower. It's a bittersweet story about struggling to grow up with issues. The story is all about a young man who's a bit on the nerdier side. He doesn't fit in with most people. He suffered some childhood trauma. He has depression. He struggles with his identity, and he's an aspiring writer. So it was definitely something that was always going to resonate with, someone like me. But there's a good chance that aspects of it will resonate with most other people, so long as they still remember their younger years and aren't in denial. He has a small group of friends. They listen to great music together. He has to struggle with his feelings for one friend while he dates another and later winds up alone. The movie is also fantastic for its portrayal of a homosexual character who, while having supportive friends, doesn't have a supportive community. It's just nice to see a homosexual relationship being treated as both just a relationship, but also something people feel the need to hide when they're younger, even though it shouldn't be hidden. And there's also a particularly beautiful scene involving a kiss between a homosexual character and a heterosexual character, and how the straight one responds to it. If you don't harbor homophobic feelings, it should tug on your heartstrings at least a little. But of course, what are the triggering issues that may affect some people? Well, it's about depression, isolation, teenage relationships and sex, underage drinking, drug use, and suicide plays a significant role in one character's life. So if you'd rather not be exposed to stuff like that, then don't come near this film. But all of this is in service to the plot and never feels like it's being used in an insensitive way. The Platform, 2019. Who doesn't like a bit of the old depressing stuff? Well, probably a few people, but everyone should try their hand at the dark, depressing stuff every now and then. And that is exactly what The Platform is. It's an experimental horror, thriller, dystopian, nightmare kind of thing, and it definitely isn't for everyone, but it's quite a ride and it's worth a watch. The Platform doesn't explain anything about its world outside the confines of a cell. The whole thing takes place in a single cell, although the cell does change around, and that cell is on top of and below a whole load of other cells. The cell constitutes a vertical prison, and the punishment is food. You see, this prison, which you can go to voluntarily for some reason, is all about class dynamics, solidarity, and isolation. When you get to the prison, they ask for your favorite food, and everyone's favorite food is then prepared every morning. And this strange floating platform then descends the vertical prison each and every day. Those on top get to dine on the best food every single day, but the food can't last until the lowest levels. And so on those levels, where food never reaches, the people either starve or resort to eating their cellmate, and hunger can do some pretty hectic things to people. So, a warning to people: if you don't like watching people eat leftover food, resort to cannibalism, kill and mutilate each other to survive, or sometimes have to deal with things involving bodily functions, then this movie will not be for you. It's, in a word, gross, but also brilliant, if a bit wonky by the end, and its messaging is sometimes rather difficult to pin down. So it's not a perfect film in any way, but it should make you think, and sometimes that's all a piece of art needs to be. Ripley's Game, 2002. Sometimes a movie doesn't stand out for doing anything particularly interestingly, but rather for just doing something well. Now, that doesn't mean that this movie doesn't do something different, but it doesn't quite stand out like some of the others. It's rather conventional, serious, and plays everything straight. It's about a career criminal who manipulates another man into doing some final violent crimes on his behalf. Now, one of the biggest draws, for me at least, is that it's got John Malkovich in it. He's the main guy, and he plays the sociopathic, cold-blooded career criminal who kind of reminds me of Hannibal Lecter, but without the cannibalism. And then we have Dougray Scott as the hapless man who falls into his trap, and then some gruffle acting from Ray Winston. It also has a surprise appearance by Lena Headey, who most know as Cersei Lannister from Game of Thrones. So, if you want to watch a nice, well, okay, maybe not nice, but a good corruption arc with a poor guy who doesn't deserve what happened to him and some great manipulation behind the scenes, then go for it. Think Breaking Bad, but on a smaller scale, and without the drugs. Ordinary man, has cancer, needs to do some bad things to make some cash. Everything in the movie is also just so toned down. Not in a bad way, not like it hides the violence or anything, but it treats it as normal and interesting. The terrible things that happen just happen. So why have I recommended this movie that isn't particularly special? Well, no, it isn't particularly special, but what it does do, it does very well. And in addition, this movie is criminally underappreciated and deserves some love. So give it some love. And as for things that could potentially offend or be triggering to someone, well, yeah, it has violence. There really isn't much else, so not much to be offended by with this one. So, that's nice. RocknRolla, 2008. I can forever hum the intro song of this movie. That isn't to say that that's the only reason to watch it, but it certainly does help a bit. Now, this movie is a Guy Ritchie film, and Guy Ritchie films tend to get a lot of love. But here's the thing. Everyone knows about Lock, Stock and Two Smoking Barrels and Snatch, and he also did those Robert Downey Jr. Sherlock Holmes movies, but so few people seem to be aware of RocknRolla. Now, for those familiar with those other two films I mentioned, this is more of the same. It's a slick crime comedy that's got a whole load of style and multiple, narrative arcs that all come together by the end. That's the Guy Ritchie formula. And so it isn't exactly something original in this film, but it doesn't need to be original when it's just doing what it does so damn well. It's got a bunch of posh and working class British gangsters, some angry Russians, a drugged up rock star, and a bored accountant who wants to be a bit naughty. And the story is all about how their lives intersect. It is absolutely fabulous, and it's a must-see for anyone who loves the kind of thing Guy Ritchie does. And so, if you liked his previous films, then just give this a go, because it's more of the same. In addition, and this is more of a nerd-out thing for me, it has a character that gives a semiotic discussion at one point. Those who don't know what semiotics is, don't worry about it. It doesn't matter. But for me, it was a fun old thing to see. Plus, it has one of the funniest scenes of all time in it, but I won't spoil it. Let's just say it involves a botched robbery and some of the aforementioned angry Russians. And who doesn't want that? Lucky Number Slevin, 2006. And now we at last get to that one movie that I said would mess with the whole alphabetical list thing. And so here it is. Do you want the best Guy Ritchie film that wasn't directed by Guy Ritchie? Because Lucky Number Slevin is that film. It's about a man who gets mistaken for another man, a man who owes a lot of debts, and now has to assassinate one gang leader's son while also having to repay money to the gang leader whose son he's supposed to kill. So he's caught between a rock and a hard place, and he needs to pay back cash and murder a guy. But it's all presented through a stylized lens with witty dialogue, bizarre set design, and a convoluted plot that comes together by the end. It also sounds confusing when stated like this, but you kind of just have to check it out for yourself, because otherwise it would spoil things. It also has a fantastic cast with Josh Hartnett as the protagonist, Lucy Liu as his neighbor, Bruce Willis as the mysterious Mr. Smith / Good Cat, Morgan Freeman as the boss, and Ben Kingsley as the rabbi. Those last two are the crime lords the protagonist has to deal with, and the back and forth between the three is always fun to watch. Now, I must admit a certain bias here, because, first of all, I love movies like this, but second of all, this movie, according to Wikipedia, has mixed reviews, and I vehemently disagree with those reviewers, whoever they were, and so while I wouldn't call this the best movie of its kind, it certainly is a thing worth watching. Now, as per usual, what's wrong with it? Well, it has an iffy portrayal of a homosexual man, but it doesn't come off as, offensive in any real way. However, other characters are homophobic about that character when they talk about him, and they do call him the fairy. So, If you don't want to hear that, then don't watch it. But even though that character is central to the overall plot, they're not particularly prevalent in the movie. So, worth the watch regardless. Role Models, 2008. This one is a bit different to the others, well, aside from Hamlet 2. It's in that vein. We've got a comedy again, and a comedy with a great cast. We've got Paul Rudd, Sean William Scott, a young Christopher Mintz-Plasse, an unhinged Jane Lynch, and a ridiculous Ken Jeong, who is as perfect as ever. But this is not a film that lends itself to analysis like many of the ones I have already and will later mention. But it's just a great bit of fun. It's about two men who get into trouble with the cops, damage some property, and then get sentenced to some community service. And their community service involves them becoming bigs for two kids. It's one of those charities that matches kids with adults who, need a friend or mentor. It's just fantastic. Paul Rudd is a miserable bastard who has to deal with Christopher Mintz-Plasse's favourite hobby, LARPing. And for those unfamiliar, live-action role-playing. They dress up like Dungeons & Dragons characters and fight in a park. And at the same time, we have Sean William Scott with his kid and his expletive-fueled outings with one another. And while this may not seem like anything special, it actually has a number of great moments with things like feeling isolated, becoming friends, becoming a role model, and letting go of your old toxic ways. There's an especially heartfelt relationship that develops between Rudd and Mintz-Plasse's character, because he's a sweet, nerdy kid and his parents are horrible people who don't understand him. Which should feel familiar to quite a few people who have felt socially isolated because of their interests. But this recommendation must come with some warnings. This film is from the 2000s, and so there are the usual things you'd expect. Some homophobic slurs around, some sexism directed at women, and some ableism. But if you can see past those dated aspects of it, you should have a good time with it. Stranger Than Fiction, 2006. Harold Crick works for the Internal Revenue Service. He's a tax auditor, and so he doesn't seem the sort to be the protagonist in his own movie, but he is. He's a taxman, and he's a rather unlikable person at first. He's immensely schedule-oriented, and he doesn't play all that nicely with others. He has no real friends or relationships outside of work. By all accounts, he has a life many would call horrible. And then one day, he starts hearing a woman's voice narrating his life. This film is definitely in the realm of metafiction. And it's all about what would happen if a character became aware of the fact that they are in someone else's story. And he needs to figure out how to fix that story, because otherwise, the narrator says that he will die at some point. And this leads Harold on a journey inwards that leads him to just live his life, and that is truly delightful to watch. Not to mention the fact that this movie has some absolutely amazing performances, and the best one comes from the main character, played by Will Ferrell, an actor I don't usually care for because of his movies usually being silly comedies, but he falls into the role of a melancholic taxman wonderfully. There is also a romance angle, which is fun if a bit poorly paced, but his romantic interest is played by the superbly anarchistic Maggie Gyllenhaal. Not to mention great performances from Emma Thompson, Queen Latifah, and Dustin Hoffman. This movie is criminally underappreciated, and it should be on everyone's watch list. Thank You for Smoking, 2005. Nick Naylor is not a good person. He isn't really a bad person either. He's a morally grey guy, but definitely doesn't come down on the side of helping others. You see, Mr. Naylor is a tobacco lobbyist. He works for the tobacco industry and he fights on their behalf. He fights to see cigarettes seen as a good thing. Or if not a good thing, then as a libertarian choice that is ultimately, neutral in and of itself. He wants to see people stop attacking cigarettes because, hey, cigarettes really aren't all that bad. The movie itself is stylish, full of witty remarks from Naylor, as he effectively argues against various people who are actually in the right, and at the same time, he has to reconcile his job with being a father. Now, the main reason this movie should be of interest to people is because it, all the way back in 2005, when it released, showed people how certain grifters operate, how they think, and how they justify their actions when they are clearly fighting for the wrong thing. Debate is something that certain very online grifters like to hold up as the highest form of socio-political discourse. And Nick Naylor shows how everything they do and say is entirely hollow. They know they are in the wrong, but, as Naylor says, if you argue correctly, you're never wrong, which is true in debates. And people are often swayed by wordplay and clever rhetoric far more than they are by facts. And nothing is better epitomized in this film than in the opening scene where Nick Naylor even manages to convince a kid with cancer that the tobacco industry isn't his enemy. This movie is well worth the watch for reasons other than Naylor. It's also just a good movie. But it has a whole lot of commentary about other problematic industries like firearms and booze. What makes it even better is that Naylor is a rather likable person. And that's what makes it scary, because the people who will try and sell you bullshit are often people who are fast-talking, seemingly witty, and seemingly charming. You should watch out for them, just like you should watch this movie. If more people had seen this movie when they were younger, then maybe there would be fewer people believing the lies of certain pundits who shall not be named here. Tropic Thunder, 2008. What do you get when you throw a bunch of big-name actors together in a meta film about filmmaking? You get something that is a lot better than it deserves to be. And it's also possibly the most talked about film on this list. Yet despite that, I feel that far too few people have actually seen this movie. It takes place in our world, and a bunch of actors who are essentially pastiche versions of an action star, played by Ben Stiller, a serious method actor, played by Robert Downey Jr., and a slapstick fat-suit fart-based comedy star, played by Jack Black. And together, they are the stars of a big-budget Vietnam War film. And it hasn't been going so well on the set, and so the director, played by Steve Coogan, decides to send them out into the wilderness so they can get real. That way, they can see the way things really are, and then they can act properly. But of course things go wrong, and then it follows the exploits of these actors lost in the jungle. The actors all have their own issues, and they reflect the problems with a lot of Hollywood. Probably one of the best parts about the movie is that Robert Downey Jr.'s character decided to go blackface for the movie, and the film comments on how the fact that a white guy can just play a black guy is kind of, fucked up and wrong. And it's one of the few instances of blackface in media that actually has a point to make with its blackface. It's not just a stupid joke. So, watch this movie. It's worth a shot. It says more than you'd expect a movie like this to say, and it's also a good bit of fun along the way. And it actually has a few things to say. Not many, but just more than your usual comedy. However, and here's where some warnings come in, it has a lot of jokes aimed at mentally disabled people. Those jokes do comment on Hollywood, like many of the jokes, but it's still definitely there. And there's also the blackface, which does serve a narrative purpose. But if it's just not something you want to see, then you're under no obligation to watch it. Tsotsi, 2005. Many of the crime movies you'll come across out there are all about the usual groups you associate with crime media. There may be some working-class British gangsters, maybe some Italian mobsters, or some African-American gangbangers. The usual things you think of when it comes to crime media. And that's why Tsotsi will likely have been forgotten by most people outside South Africa, even though it won an Academy Award for Best Foreign Language Film, and more people should know it. It's set in the South African Alexandra Township, and it follows a young man known as Tsotsi, which pretty much means thug, and it's about his life of crime and the subsequent fallout of that lifestyle. The basic premise is that he's trying to be a criminal, although he doesn't react all that well to people being killed, and so when he hijacks a car and discovers a baby on the back, he doesn't quite know what to do. The story is about his life, his upbringing, the intense levels of poverty found in South Africa that led to this young man's criminal life, and the redemption he seeks in caring for the baby he accidentally kidnapped. It's a story that, unlike many other crime narratives, does not glorify crime and instead sees it as the social issue it is. It's gritty, it's unhappy, but it's sympathetic. What caused Tsotsi to be like this, and why did he try to care for the child when he could have abandoned it? This is a film that deserves to be watched at least once, but it isn't too pleasant a viewing experience, but it certainly has a few heartwarming moments. Don't watch it if you can't handle scenes of intense poverty and domestic and animal abuse, but if things like this make you uncomfortable, then you probably should watch it so you can understand what much of the world has to go through. Anyway, the rest of the movies are on the fun side, so let's move on to Undercover Brother, 2002. In the world of Undercover Brother, systemic racism kinda doesn't exist. You see, instead of it being a myriad of often unconscious or invisible factors that influence the way in which people of colour are treated by society, it's rather an actual conspiracy perpetuated by the Man. The Man is an evil organisation that seeks to keep the whites in power while repressing black culture, or, as the Man himself says when the possibility of a black person becoming president appears, "I want the White House to remain white." The story follows the Brotherhood, a secret organization that fights against the Man and its attempts to thwart the Man's plans. Unintentional rhyme. And the Brotherhood is made up of just black people and one white intern because of affirmative action. So, in case you couldn't figure it out on your own, this is very much a comedy. It's a spoof of old school blaxploitation and espionage films, but with a stunning cast. Amazing cast that includes Eddie Griffin. I apologize, I do not actually know how to pronounce her name. Janine Ellis, but she's fantastic. Chi McBride, Billy D. Williams, Dave Chappelle, and Neil Patrick Harris. And for those who are curious, he's the intern. The movie is silly as all hell, and that's what you sometimes need in life. You need a goofy comedy that's all about black people embracing their culture and fighting against the Man. Now, to be fair, it has a lot of humour that can be seen as stereotypical, or as homage, depending on your perspective. And it does have several of the old tired jokes you've seen before, including an obligatory black versus white penis joke. And it's also pretty sexist. But hey, it's a good bit of fun and quite unlike anything else out there. It's also one of the few actually good comedy espionage films out there. Walk Hard, the Dewey Cox Story, 2007. And we come to our final movie. And this is a fun one. Do you enjoy Oscar bait biopics about musicians? Those things like Walk the Line, Ray, and Bohemian Rhapsody? Well, this movie is pretty much a parody of all of them. Now, this is a parody in the same way Galaxy Quest is a parody. It doesn't necessarily parody any particular film, and rather parodies a genre. This is the story of Dewey Cox, a fictional musician who got started at about the same time as Elvis, and then just faded into obscurity like many of these old school rockers did. The story follows his life from his childhood to his early career in the 50s to his Bob Dylan-inspired 60s to his burnout 70s, and the whole ride is just far too fun. It's a movie that has him walking in on a room full of drug users, and one of them shouts, "These are uppers and downers, the logical next step for you!" And so he progresses through all the stereotypes: hooked on drugs, promiscuous to a fault, far too many abandoned kids, multiple wives, lots of heartbreak. It's all those rock and roll stories distilled down into one. There's a certain problem that comes with many of those biopic films, and it's the issue of pacing. It often feels like they're rushing through this person's life and compressing things, but here it's all fictional. And the pacing is superb if, and I mean very much if, you get the director's cut. If it isn't 2 hours long, it's the wrong cut of the movie. Get the right cut. Dear God, get the right cut. The theatrical release is really not good at all. Anyway, the movie doesn't really have anything in it that's particularly problematic in any real sense. It's just a fun time. And one of my personal favorite films of all time for some reason. And so it's great to be ending off on it.
And that is 21 movies that I think are worth watching. Hopefully, at least some of them are, maybe wind up on some people's watch lists. You never know. Maybe something that you actually enjoy comes through. Stranger things have happened. And that's pretty much that for this video. So I hope that you enjoyed it. And because it's YouTube and such, do the things, the like and the subscribe and the comment. As a matter of fact, if you can think of any other recommendations, like interesting films, things that you think a lot of people don't really know about, maybe put it in the comments. You can just say, I think that this is a good movie. Watch it. Or don't. I mean, it's ultimately entirely up to you. Unless it isn't. Anyway, hope that everybody has an absolutely splendid day further. Ciao.